The day King Richard the Lionheart was set free, a chill ran down the spine of Europe. For months he had been a prisoner, held by the Holy Roman Emperor, and rumors of his fate had spread like wildfire. Some said he was dead, others that he had been tortured beyond recognition. But on that cold February morning in 1194, the truth was revealed. Richard was not just alive, he was more determined and ferocious than ever. As the news spread, King Philip II of France, Richard's bitter rival, scribbled a hasty letter to John, Richard's treacherous brother. "Look to yourself," Philip wrote. "The devil is loose." The words were a stark warning, but they were also a testament to the fear that Richard inspired. For those who knew him, the Lionheart was a force of nature, a warrior king whose return meant that the balance of power in Europe was about to shift dramatically. Richard's release came at a steep price. His kingdom had been drained dry to pay the ransom, a staggering 100,000 marks of silver, with another 50,000 to be paid later. The taxes had been brutal, a 25% levy on income and movable property. Monasteries and churches had been stripped of their treasures, and even the humblest parish had to contribute. But the people of England, despite the heavy burden, had rallied behind their king. They believed in Richard's cause, and they were willing to make any sacrifice to bring him home. Richard's journey back to England was a triumphal procession. He landed at Sandwich in Kent on March 20th, and was greeted by cheering crowds. 3 days later, he entered London, riding through the decorated streets to the Church of St. Paul's. The city was decked out in his honor, and the people shouted with joy as their king returned. But Richard knew that there was no time for celebration. His kingdom was in disarray, and his brother John had been plotting against him. John, who had always been envious of his older brother, had tried to seize the throne during Richard's captivity. He had aligned himself with Philip II, and had even given away key castles to the French. But when Richard arrived, John's rebellion crumbled. Within days, John was forced to surrender his strongholds, including the mighty castles of Tickhill and Nottingham. Richard, showing a mix of mercy and pragmatism, forgave his brother. "You are a child, and you have had bad men looking after you," Richard said, lifting John to his feet. "Those who thought to give you bad advice will get their deserts. Get up and go and eat." Richard's first act as a free man was to reassert his authority. He convened a grand assembly at Winchester Cathedral, where he was crowned in a ceremony that was almost as grand as his original coronation. Dressed in royal regalia with a heavy crown on his head, he walked through the cathedral, flanked by the earls and knights of England. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had been a constant presence during his captivity, looked on with pride. Outside, the people of England celebrated their king's return, but Richard knew that the real work was just beginning. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Richard moved swiftly to consolidate his power, punishing those who had betrayed him and rewarding those who had remained loyal. He reinstated Hubert Walter, a trusted ally, as Archbishop of Canterbury and Chief Justiciar. Walter, known for his administrative skills and bravery, quickly set about restoring order and ensuring that the royal coffers were full. He led a judicial tour of England, cracking down on lawlessness and ensuring that the king's rights were upheld. The royal government, under Walter's leadership, became more efficient and profitable, and the people of England, despite the heavy taxes, felt a renewed sense of stability and pride. But Richard's focus was not just on England. He had a larger empire to protect, and the threat from Philip II was growing. The French king had taken advantage of Richard's absence to seize key territories in Normandy, including the strategic castle of Gisors. Richard knew that he had to act fast. On May 12, 1194, he set sail from Portsmouth, bound for Normandy. His fleet was a sight to behold, 100 ships packed with soldiers, siege engines, and supplies. When he arrived at Barfleur, the town erupted in celebration. People danced in the streets, and the bells rang out in triumph. William Marshall, a seasoned knight who had known the Plantagenet family for decades, described the scene as one of the most joyful he had ever witnessed. But Richard's return was not just a moment of triumph, it was also a call to arms. The war against Philip II was about to begin, and it would be a fierce and dangerous one. Richard's armies, a mix of knights, mercenaries, and siege experts, were ready to fight. The king himself was at the forefront, leading his men with the same courage and ferocity that had made him a legend. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Richard the Lionheart was back, and he was ready to reclaim what was rightfully his. The winter of 1195 to 1196 was a time of great victories for King Richard. He successfully attacked the port of Dieppe, which the French king Philip had given to his ally, the Count of Ponthieu. When Philip tried to attack Issoudun, Richard stopped him. In the peace talks that followed, Philip agreed to give up his claims to most of Richard's lands, except for a small area called the Norman Vexin and a few important castles. Philip also ended his alliance with Toulouse, which had been a thorn in Richard's side for a long time. This move reshaped the politics of the region and showed that Philip was more interested in Normandy and the Vexin than in breaking up the Plantagenet Empire in the south. However, things changed in 1196 when Philip gained custody of Richard's 9-year-old nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur was the only male heir to the Plantagenet lands if Richard died without a son. His mother, Constance, refused to bring Arthur to Richard's court, so Richard invaded Brittany. The Bretons, who didn't like Plantagenet rule, sent Arthur to Philip's court for safety. Philip now had a powerful advantage. Richard's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre had produced no children, and rumors circulated about his personal life. Arthur, who spent time with Philip's young son Louis, became a potential heir that Philip could use against Richard. By the summer of 1197, Richard's luck improved. He successfully won over Philip's neighbors and turned the tide of the war in his favor. Arthur was returned to Brittany, and Constance began involving him in the government. Richard's embargo on trade with Flanders weakened Philip's alliance with Count Baldwin of Flanders. Richard also survived a serious injury from a crossbow bolt during a siege. He began building a massive fortress called Chateau Gaillard in the Vexin, which became his favorite residence. This castle was a symbol of Richard's strength and a strategic base for his campaigns. In 1197, Richard's influence grew even more when Baldwin of Flanders broke away from Philip. Richard's connections with German princes paid off when his nephew, Otto, was chosen as the new Holy Roman Emperor. This made Richard even more powerful, and many French nobles returned to his side. In September 1197, Richard launched a surprise attack on Philip's army at Gizers. According to William Marshall, Richard charged into battle like a lion, and Philip narrowly escaped when a bridge collapsed. Richard's dominance in the Vexin was clear, and Philip had little choice but to seek a truce. Negotiations began in January 1199, with the papal legate Peter of Capua trying to mediate. Richard was angry with the church for abandoning him during his imprisonment, and demanded the return of all his land. Philip agreed, except for the castle of Gizers, which he hoped to secure through a marriage alliance. The negotiations dragged on, and tensions remained high. In March 1199, a revolt broke out in the south, led by the Count of Angoulême and the Viscount of Limoges. Richard quickly responded and laid siege to the castle of Châlus-Chabrol. Despite the castle's small garrison, the siege lasted 3 days. On the evening of March 26th, Richard left his tent to inspect the defenses. A lone defender, Peter Basilius, fired a crossbow bolt at Richard, hitting him in the shoulder. Richard, admiring the defender's bravery, tried to dodge but was too late. The bolt sank deep into his shoulder. Richard returned to his tent, where the wound festered and became infected. His condition worsened, and he refused to leave his quarters. Only a few trusted men were allowed to see him. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was summoned, and she arrived just before Richard forgave the brave defender and died on April 6, 1199. The death of Richard the Lionheart was a shock to all. He had no legitimate heir, and his brother John and nephew Arthur were the main contenders for the throne. Richard's death meant that the future of the Plantagenet Empire was uncertain. The truce with Philip was personal, and with Richard gone, the political landscape of Europe was about to change dramatically. The night was thick with tension as Marshall and Walter debated the succession, the future of the realm hanging in the balance. Marshall, a loyalist to the core, believed that John, the younger brother, should inherit the throne. He argued that Arthur, the son of Geoffrey, was too headstrong and lacked good counsel. Arthur doesn't listen to anyone and will only cause harm, Marshall warned. John, on the other hand, is the closest in line and has a better claim to the lands of his father and brother. Walter was skeptical. He knew that the laws of succession were murky and that many disagreed on who should rule. "I've seen John's past," Walter said gravely. "He's unpredictable and untrustworthy. You'll regret this more than anything else." John's reputation was tarnished by a history of treachery and poor decisions. He had betrayed his brother Richard during his captivity, meddled with church appointments, and even tried to keep Richard imprisoned. Despite his recent good behavior, many still saw him as a weak and cruel leader. His mean-spiritedness and cruel jokes about others' misfortunes only added to the distrust. When Richard died unexpectedly in 1199, John moved quickly to secure the throne. He seized the royal treasure at Chinon, visited his brother's tomb, and tried to rally support. But the winds of opinion were already shifting in favor of Arthur. The barons of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine declared for Arthur, cutting off Normandy from the rest of Aquitaine. John barely escaped a trap set by Philip II and Arthur's forces at Le Mans. In Rouen, however, John found a more welcoming reception. On April 25, 1199, he was invested as Duke of Normandy with a crown of golden roses. This was a crucial victory, as losing Normandy would have been a disastrous start to his reign. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, also played a vital role. Despite her earlier disappointment with John, she rallied her forces and supported him in Aquitaine. She even sent the mercenary Captain Mercadier to help secure John's succession. Marshall, now convinced of John's legitimacy, sent envoys to the English barons to swear fealty. With the support of Hubert Walter and Geoffrey Fitzpeter, John was accepted as king, but his rule was far from secure. Many in Gascony, Limousin, Poitou, Anjou, and Brittany still refused to accept him. In January 1200, John met Philip II of France on the border between their lands. The two kings, close in age but worlds apart in experience, talked about a truce and embraced warmly. John, eager to establish himself, made significant concessions in the Treaty of La Goulette. Philip recognized John's claim to most of the Plantagenet lands, but John had to give up several strategic territories, including parts of the Norman Vexin and Berry. He also had to pay a heavy tribute and renounce alliances with Flanders and Boulogne, effectively acknowledging Philip as his feudal overlord. These concessions were seen by some as a sign of weakness, and John earned the nickname Soft Sword. His detractors argued that he had given away too much, while others saw it as a pragmatic move to avoid further conflict. John's financial and military situation was precarious, and he needed peace to consolidate his rule. Despite the treaty, tensions remained high. In July 1202, Arthur of Brittany, now allied with Philip II and the Lusignans, launched an attack on Mirebeau Castle, where his grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was staying. Eleanor, at 78, was still a formidable figure. Arthur and his forces, including Hugh de Lusignan, who harbored deep resentment against John for stealing his bride, Isabella of Angoulême, were determined to capture her. Eleanor, from the castle walls, recognized the threat. Arthur's ambition and the Lusignans' hatred of John had driven them to this desperate act. The siege of Mirebeau was a pivotal moment, one that would test John's leadership and the loyalty of his supporters. The war for succession was far from over, and the future of the Plantagenet realm hung in the balance. Eleanor, from her sick de Fontevraud, watched the political storm with growing worry. She knew her grandson, Arthur, and his new friends saw her as a threat. One day, she received news that Arthur and Hugh de Lusignan were heading her way. Eleanor, not wanting to be caught, quickly left Fontevraud and fled to Poitiers, but they caught up with her at Mirebeau. Eleanor's only hope was that her son John, who was in Normandy, might come to her rescue. John was in Le Mans, building a mercenary army to defend his territories. He had been working hard all summer to gather enough men to face Philip II and Arthur. When he heard about Eleanor's situation, he knew he had to act fast. John and his men covered 80 miles in less than 2 days, a feat that even the most seasoned soldiers would find challenging. When John and his army reached Mirebeau, they found that Arthur and his men had already taken over the town. They had blocked all but one of the gates with earth, confident that they could hold off any attack, but John had a plan. He had recruited William des Roches, a powerful local lord who knew Marebo well. Des Roches agreed to lead the attack on the condition that he would have a say in what happened to Arthur if he was captured. John agreed, and they prepared to attack at dawn. The next morning, as the sun rose, Arthur's men were enjoying a breakfast of roasted pigeons when John's forces launched a surprise attack. The gate was quickly breached, and a fierce battle broke out in the streets. Des Roches, leading the charge, was a formidable fighter. He lost 3 horses but kept pushing forward. The rebels, caught off guard, fled to the castle, but they couldn't hold out for long. John's forces overwhelmed them, and by the end of the day, Eleanor was free, and Arthur, Hugh, and Geoffrey de Lusignan, along with 252 of their knights, were captured. It was a stunning victory, the likes of which hadn't been seen since Richard's triumph at Jaffa. John paraded his prisoners through the streets, warning others of the consequences of rebellion. Arthur and Geoffrey were taken to Falaise in Normandy, while Hugh was held in Keene. Many of the other prisoners were sent to English strongholds like Corfe Castle in Dorset. Arthur's imprisonment was particularly harsh. He was kept in terrible conditions at Falaise, a large castle with a history dating back to William the Conqueror. Despite his noble status, Arthur was treated brutally. John, who had no children of his own, saw Arthur as a threat to his rule. Arthur, being the heir presumptive to the English throne, must have believed that John wouldn't dare harm him. But John was not one to play by the rules. As Arthur languished in his cell, John's rule began to crumble. Normandy, once a loyal part of the Plantagenet Empire, was torn apart by rebellion and treason. John's allies were deserting him, and his reputation for cruelty was growing. William des Roches, who had helped capture Arthur, felt betrayed and joined Philip II's side. This loss was a significant blow to John, and soon more of his allies followed suit. By the end of 1203, John's control over Anjou and Aquitaine was slipping away. His castles were falling, and his supporters were rebelling. He released the Lusignans from prison, hoping they would rally to his cause, but they turned against him. John's attempts to maintain order in the south were ineffective, and the powerful residents of Aquitaine neither feared nor trusted him. John's desperation led him to act even more cruelly. He garrisoned his castles with mercenaries, who plundered the local towns and monasteries, further alienating the population. In England, when 25 prisoners tried to escape from Corfe Castle, they were starved to death. John, though not present, was responsible for the atrocity. In early 1203, John ordered Arthur's jailer, Hubert de Burgh, to blind and castrate the young duke. De Burgh, feeling a pang of conscience, refused and spread the rumor that Arthur had died. The Bretons, believing their leader was murdered, vowed to avenge him. De Burgh later revealed that Arthur was still alive, but the damage was done. The Bretons had a moral justification for their attacks on John. John's situation worsened in the spring of 1203. Philip and his allies controlled Brittany, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. John's forces were pushed back into Poitou, where his mother, now too frail to help, could do little. The French continued to attack the border fortresses of Normandy, and John's allies were deserting him. John, feeling increasingly isolated and desperate, struggled to hold on. On the Thursday before Easter, John was in Rouen, drunk and angry. He was surrounded by enemies and plagued by dark thoughts. Arthur was also in Rouen, held in a dungeon. William de Brieux, a powerful nobleman who had captured Arthur at Marebo, escorted the prisoner to John. Brieux warned that he could no longer guarantee Arthur's safety, knowing John's mood. That night, after a drunken dinner, John's rage took over. According to witnesses, he was possessed by the devil. John entered Arthur's cell, and in a fit of fury killed the young duke. He then tied a heavy stone to Arthur's body, and threw it into the Seine. The body was later found by a fisherman, and secretly buried by the nuns of Notre Dame des Prés. John sent a cryptic letter to his mother, Eleanor, saying that the grace of God is even more with us now, but his actions had dire consequences. The news of Arthur's death spread, and Philip II used it as a negotiating tool. "No peace until you produce Arthur," became the French king's mantra. John, unable to produce a living Arthur, found himself in an impossible position. Philip took advantage of John's weakness. He moved freely through Plantagenet territories. taking castles and fortresses with ease. John, trapped in Normandy, could do little to stop him. The French army approached Chateau Gaillard, Richard's mighty citadel. John attempted to break the French blockade with a flotilla of supply boats, but the mission failed. The French defenders picked off John's ships one by one, and the Seine ran red with blood. John's situation was grim. His empire was falling apart, and his allies were deserting him. The future looked bleak for the once powerful King John. The winter of 1204 was one of the coldest and cruelest England had ever seen. Ice covered the Thames, and the ground was so hard that farmers couldn't plow their fields until late March. Crops were destroyed, and people starved. The cost of food soared, and many wondered if God was punishing King John for losing Normandy. John, who had promised to stay in Normandy and fight, fled back to England in December 1203. He left his loyalists to defend the duchy, but they were no match for Philip Augustus, who was determined to crush the Plantagenets. John's reputation was at an all-time low. He was seen as a coward and a failure, and the English people were worried about an invasion from France. To prepare for the worst, John held a council in January 1205 and ordered every man over 12 to swear an oath to defend the realm. Those who refused would be punished with disinheritance or slavery. Ships were not allowed to leave the ports without the king's permission. Despite these measures, fear spread through the country, and people believed that Philip Augustus would attack. The situation in France was dire. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine were almost entirely under Philip's control. John's name was Mud, and rumors circulated that he had murdered his young nephew, Arthur of Brittany. In Aquitaine, John's mother, Eleanor, died in April 1204, and her death marked the end of her support for her son. The lords of Aquitaine, who had once respected Eleanor, now turned to Philip. John's brother-in-law, Alfonso VIII of Castile, even invaded Gascony, claiming it as his own. John knew he had to act. In the summer of 1205, he prepared a massive invasion force, with a fleet from Portsmouth ready to attack Normandy and another from Dartmouth to advance on Poitou. He seized ships and recruited thousands of soldiers, spending a quarter of his annual revenue on war preparation. The English coast buzzed with activity, but the barons were not as enthusiastic. They had already chosen sides between England and France, and many were unwilling to fight for lands they no longer cared about. At Portchester Castle, John had a heated argument with William Marshal, one of his most trusted allies. Marshal warned the king that he was planning to disinherit the barons, and the barons refused to join the invasion. King John, furious, sailed up and down the coast, hoping to shame the barons into action, but it was too late. The invasion was a failure, and Philip continued his conquest of Touraine. However, 1206 brought a glimmer of hope. John spent the winter sending treasure to potential allies and touring northern England to win the support of the barons. In April, he led another expedition to Poitou, where he recovered parts of Aquitaine, including the Saintonge and Angoulême. He also drove back Alfonso VIII from Gascony and formed an alliance with the powerful Poitevin Baron Aymery de Thouars. By October, John and Philip agreed to a 2-year truce. John's efforts in 1206 showed that he was not entirely without skill or determination, but the damage was done. The vast empire built by Henry II and Richard I was now a shadow of its former self. John had lost most of Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, and his reputation was tarnished. The Plantagenet dynasty, once the most powerful in Europe, was now on the defensive. The years ahead would be filled with more challenges and strife, but for now, John had managed to salvage some of what remained of his empire. The road ahead was uncertain, but the king was determined to keep fighting, even if the future seemed bleak.